How's it going, Ghostlings? My name is Ghost Aniki, and welcome back to D&D class, where we're going to be discussing everything D&D. Today we are going to be continuing on in our character creation series with what is possibly the most daunting part of character creation and really D&D playing for most new players, which is spellcasting. Spellcasting is going to look different character to character, depending on what class you choose, subclass, abilities, items. There's a lot of things that it's dependent on. But there are some basics that we're going to cover as far as spellcasting is concerned. There are some things that we're going to look into with each different class and how each class handles spellcasting. And then we're going to finish up our spellcasting page for our character. Now, there are only 4 official D&D classes that don't have spellcasting rules. Those are Monk, Rogue, Fighter, and Barbarian. There are some subclasses that give spellcasting rules later on, but those are kind of a situational thing. You kind of have to play those by ear, because even within those, they work a little differently. But every other class outside of those 4 does have spellcasting rules and follows the same typical spellcasting terminology, rules, rulings, design, things like that, with slight variations between them. But for the most part, they all follow the same basic general rules. When making your character, you'll see that you have a class spell list. The class spell list is, simply put, the list of cantrips and spells that your character can learn. Each class that can do spellcasting has a specific class spellcasting list that they'll pull from. There are some exceptions that allow you to pull from other classes' spell lists, such as different subclasses, feats, items, things like that. But for the most part, the majority of your spells will be coming from your class's spell list. The class spell lists are divided into cantrips and then 1st through 9th level spells, and within each of those categories you have the spell name, the school of magic that spell comes from, the casting time it takes to cast that spell effectively, the range of the spell, the duration of effect of the spell, the components of the spell, and if the spell is a ritual. Now, a ritual spell, it works a little bit differently. Some classes allow for you to cast ritual spells, which means that it takes 10 minutes longer to cast the spell, but you don't use a spell slot to cast it. It's kind of one of those things where if you have extra time and you don't want to use a spell slot, you want to save it for later on, you would cast a ritual so that you don't expend that spell slot. Now, you have to be able to cast ritual spells to begin with. That's the first thing. Some classes can't. And you also must have the spell prepared in your spells known list before you can cast it as a ritual. But aside from those things, that's all a ritual is it's casting a spell over a longer period of time so that you don't use a spell slot. A lot of the information on these spell casting lists are pretty self-explanatory. You've got your casting time, which is how long it takes to cast a spell. This could be anything from 1 or more actions. It could be a reaction that you use. It could be a bonus action. It could be a certain amount of minutes, 10 minutes, whatever. Just however long it takes to cast that spell. Then you've got your range. It's your targets or how far out you can cast. A spell could have a target of yourself, in which case your range is you. It could be a certain number of feet, so 10 feet, 20 feet, 120 feet, whatever. You can cast it by touch, so if you touch an item or another entity, that's when the spell is in effect. And it could be something as much as a certain type of radius. So you could have a cube of effect. The spell is within a cube. It could be a cone going outwards, a triangle of effect. Your range is your distance, your target, and the type of area effect it has. And then you've got your duration, which is just the duration of how long the spell lasts. It could be based on how many rounds in combat it takes, a number of minutes, a number of days, hours. It could be an instantaneous thing, which means it ends right after the effect. But your duration is just how long the spell lasts. There is the component of concentration, which we'll get into in a second, which changes some of those a little bit. But typically your duration is just how long the spell lasts. Concentration and components are the 2 things that get a little trickier with spellcasting. Concentration is a slightly different ruling for the duration of some spells. If a spell requires concentration, it means that your character must concentrate on the spell, and as long as they are, its effects are active for a maximum amount of time. So if a spell says it requires concentration up to 1 minute, that means that as long as you're concentrating on the spell, its effects are active for up to a minute. Now, normal activity like moving and attacking doesn't interfere with concentration, but there are some things that will break your character's concentration. You can only cast one concentration spell at a time. If you try to cast another one, the first one becomes inactive, and the second one is the one that you're then concentrating on. Taking damage. If you take damage while concentrating on a spell, you have to make a Constitution saving throw to maintain your concentration. The difficulty class of that roll is equal to 10 or half the damage you take, whichever number is higher. So if you take, say, 12 damage from an attack, your difficulty class for the Constitution saving throw would have to be 12 or higher. If you take damage from multiple sources, multiple enemies, like you take damage from someone swinging a sword at you and another person casts a spell at you, and both hit, you have to make separate saving throws for each source of damage. The third thing that would break concentration is being incapacitated or killed. Obviously, if you can no longer focus on something, you're going to lose concentration. So those are the three main things that will break concentration based on D&D rulings. Your individual DM may also decide that certain environmental factors or other things may break concentration, like, say, thunder claps out in the distance, or there's a wave that hits the boat that you're on, or something like that. They may decide that those environmental factors are enough to break your character's concentration on the spell, but those are more kind of a case-by-case scenario. Casting concentration spells, taking damage, or being incapacitated or killed are the three primary things that can break concentration. The other less self-explanatory part of the spellcasting list that I want to go over is components versus spellcasting focus. Every spell has listed some components that are required for casting. These components can be verbal, which is marked with a V, somatic, which is marked with an S, or material, which is marked with an M. Verbal means that you have to be able to speak and make sounds to cast a spell. Anything that would prevent you from being able to verbalize would prevent you from being able to cast a spell unless otherwise mentioned. Somatic components are gestures. You may have to do a certain hand signal or move an item in a certain way or things like that, or be able to touch the affected item or person. And so you have to have at least one free hand open to cast a spell that has a somatic component. And then material components require particular objects which are specified for the spell. This could be, say, a small baggie of sand, or a branch from a certain kind of tree, or something like that. Just material components that are required for casting the spell. Different spells have combinations of verbal, somatic, and material requirements. It could have all of them, it could have one of them, but you're going to have some level of components required. Now, you do have an option in most spellcasting classes to have a spellcasting focus. So, for an example, as a bard, my instruments would be my spellcasting focus, or as a School of Swords bard, which is the subclass I've chosen, my weapons that I'm proficient with can be my spellcasting focus. What a spellcasting focus does is it removes the requirement to have a material component to the spells, as long as the material component does not have a monetary value. So if, say, a spell requires, like I said, a bag of sand, that typically doesn't have a monetary value listed, so I can use my spellcasting focus in place of the material components. Now, different DMs will rule differently. Some have an amount that the spellcasting focus can go up to. One common one that I've heard is the spellcasting focus can replace material components up to a value of like 100 gold or something like that. There's some slight variation, but typically the spellcasting focus is used to eliminate the need for material components, which means that, your player won't have to go out and constantly be buying all these material components and have them on them at all times and things like that. But the spellcasting components, verbal, somatic, and material, are listed on the spellcasting lists as V, S, and M, and like I said, they're typically combined. It just depends on the spell that you need to use. Next, we come to spell levels and the amount of spells you can know and use at any given time. Spells are divided up into 10 different levels. You have cantrips and then levels 1 through 9 spells. Cantrips are essentially level 0. These are spells that you can use at will. You don't have to prepare them, you don't have to have them set, you can just use them. Every class at different levels has an amount of cantrips you can know. So as a bard at level 3, I can know 2 cantrips at a time, and I can use them at will without expending spell slots or having to have them prepared. But I'm limited to those 2 known until I can switch them out or I get more that I can learn. Then you have how many spells you can know and the spell slots that you have. So again, as a level 3 bard, I can know 6 spells. But those have limitations depending on my spell slots. Spell slots are how many of what level spells you can use. As a 3rd level bard, I have 4 first level spell slots and 2 second level spell slots. This could mean I could cast 6 level 1 spells, but I will not be able to cast anything beyond a level 2 spell at any given point. And once my spell slots are done, I am out of spells that I can use other than cantrips until I perform a short or long rest. Your spell slots also determine what spells you can or can't learn. So at level 3, like I said, I have 4 level 1 and 2 level 2 spell slots. This means that I'm limited to learning up to level 2 spells. I can't learn level 3 or higher spells because I don't have the spell slots for them. Now once I reach, looks like level 5 as an example, I then get my first set of 3rd level spell slots, which means I can start learning 3rd level spells, and I can start to diversify in that way. But your spell slots and your spells known and your cantrips known put a limit to how many spells and cantrips you can know and how many you can use at any given time. So again, as a 3rd level bard, I can know 2 cantrips. I can use those cantrips as much as I want, I can use them at will, I can use them without preparing them, but I'm limited to those 2. I have 6 spells that I can know at any given time. Those have to be of level 1 or level 2, because I only have levels 1 and 2 spell slots. But I have 4 level 1 and 2 level 2 spell slots, which means that I can play around with how many times I cast each of those different spells. You can also use higher level spell slots to cast certain spells at higher level to have more of an effect, such as spells like Healing Word. You can cast that at a higher level if you have the spell slots available so that the effects are stronger, but it's not necessary. There are just some different ways that you can play around with it to use your spell slots and to use your spells most effectively for what you need in battle. The final set of general information for spellcasting that's across the board for all classes are your spellcasting stats, so to speak. You've got your spellcasting ability, your spell save DC, and your spell attack modifier. So your spellcasting ability is simply put what stat you use for your spellcasting. Are you using charisma, are you using wisdom, or are you using intelligence? Different spellcasting classes use different ones. As a bard, my spellcasting ability would be charisma, but for something like, I believe, clerics, it would be wisdom. For wizards, it would be intelligence, things like that. It's just determining what stat you're using for your spellcasting. Your spell save DC is just how hard it is for an enemy to avoid the effects of your spells. Some spells specify that a target has to make a saving throw to avoid some or all of the spell's effects, and if they do so, they can either negate some of the damage or effect or completely remove it entirely. But if they fail, then the full effect of the spell hits them. And what they do is they will roll against your spell save DC, which is 8 plus your spellcasting modifier plus your proficiency bonus and any other special modifiers you may have for it. But the baseline is 8 plus your spellcasting modifier plus your proficiency bonus. That's going to be your spell save DC for every class. And then you have your spell attack modifiers. Some spells require you to make an attack roll to determine whether the effect hits the intended target. Spells like, or I guess it's a cantrip, but Eldritch Blast requires an attack roll. Your attack bonus with spell attacks is your spell ability modifier and your proficiency bonus. So it's the same thing as with your saving throw, but without the additional 8. Most spells that require attack rolls are ranged, but that's not always the case. Just keep in mind that you have disadvantage on ranged attack rolls if you're within 5 feet of a hostile creature. that you can see and that isn't incapacitated. But that's the generals for the spell stats. You have your spellcasting ability, which is what stat you use for spellcasting. You have your saving throw, which is the difficulty class it requires for an enemy to lessen or evade your spell's effects, and your attack rolls, which is just to see if your spell actually hits whenever you cast it at an enemy or a target. So those were all the general things that connect all the spellcasters together. Those are all the things that are going to be the same across the board. Now we're going to get into how the different spellcasters are different from each other and how they operate differently. And to do that, I'm going to divide them up into 3 categories. They are all based on how a spellcaster gains their spells and learns them over time. So you have your spellcasters that learn their spells, your spellcasters that prepare their spells, and your special rule spellcasters. The first group of spellcasters is probably the easiest to learn and play. It's what I'm going to call the learners. This group includes bards, sorcerers, and rangers. In this group, at each level, you have a certain amount of spells you can learn. And you can learn spells of a level for which you have spell slots. So if you have, say, up to level 3 spell slots, you can learn spells of level 3 or lower. You can't go any higher than that. Once you learn those spells, you've got them prepared, they're ready, and you can use them as long as you have spell slots. There's no extra preparation time, there's no having to switch them in and out. Once you've got them, you've got them. And then at each level, you can also choose to unlearn a spell and learn a new one to switch around your list. But you are limited to the spells that you know and the spell slots that you have. The next group of casters is a little bit more complicated and what I'm calling the preparers. The preparers are your paladins, your clerics, your artificers, and your druids. Rather than having a set amount of spells that the character can learn, they have a set amount that they can prepare. So you will take your spellcasting modifier plus your class level with a minimum of 1 spell, and that's how many spells you can prepare at any given time. So say you're a cleric. I'll use the cleric as an example for this one. You would take your wisdom modifier plus your cleric level, and that's how many prepared spells you have. Again, with a minimum of 1 spell. And every spell you learn must be a level for which you have spell slots. So if you have only up to level 3 spell slots, you can only prepare level 3 spells and lower. You can change your prepared spells when you finish a long rest, each time you finish a long rest, but it requires time. And that time is going to vary depending on what class you're playing. So again, using the cleric as an example, you would spend time in prayer and meditation to whatever deity your cleric is serving, and you have to spend at least 1 minute per spell level for each spell on your list that you're preparing. So at level 3, say you're preparing 3 level 1 spells. You have to spend then 3 minutes in prayer, meditation, however you want to call it, to prepare those spells. Each of the preparers work in that same way, where there is time required to prepare your spells list, but it can pull from any of the spells on that class's spell list. So the learners, the bards, sorcerers, and rangers, once they learn the spell, they have to wait till they level up to change what spells they have access to. Your preparers, your clerics, your paladins, your artificers, and your druids don't have that same restriction. They can pull from any spells from their respective class list, but they have to spend time preparing them and planning ahead of what they want to use. The final group of casters is what I'm calling the special casters. These are your wizards and warlocks. All this means is that both of these classes follow the same conventions as one of the other 2 groups, but they have an additional ruling on top of their spellcasting mechanics. The wizard follows the same rules as the preparers. They have to prepare their spells and have a prepared list that they have to set up at the end of a long rest. But they also have their spell book. Their spell book is where they write down all their spells that they come across through their adventures. They'll write down any wizard spells that they come across, and they can spend time learning those spells and perfecting them. What this does for them is it allows them to cast spells as rituals without having to have them in their prepared slots. So if you look at it as the preparers have a certain amount of prepared slots that they can use. The wizard has those, but they can also cast spells as rituals as long as it's in their book, whereas the preparers, like the clerics and paladins, can't. If the paladins and clerics want to use a spell as a ritual, they have to prepare it first. The wizard doesn't have to do that. They can just focus on their prepared slots being for combat and for utility rather than for rituals. The other special caster is warlocks. For all intents and purposes, warlocks follow the same spellcasting style as the learners. They have a certain amount of spells that they can learn, and as long as they have the spell slots available, they can use those spells. The difference comes in what spell slots they have. Warlocks only have access to up to level 5 spell slots. Reason being is they have abilities and patron features later on in higher levels that allow them to cast higher level spells differently. But for the most part, they only have up to level 5 spell slots, and everything else comes as abilities and later features. But in terms of learning their spells and preparing them, they follow the same conventions as the learners. Each class's way they cast spells and how they gain their spells is specific to the class and to the character's backstory. That's where you kind of have a little bit more fun and liberty in how you cast your spells, you know. So as a bard, as an example, magic comes from music. It comes from the music of the world. It comes from creation and artistry and different things like that. So as a bard of the School of Swords, I could say that my magic comes from the different ways I move with my swords in battle. You know, if I slash my swords a certain way, that creates this magical effect and connects me to the world around me. A wizard, they gain their spells by learning. They write down their spells in their book. This book could be passed down from their teacher, or it could be something they found in an ancient crypt or something like that. How you cast your spells and the story behind it is where you can get some creative liberties with your spells. Everything else is just the mechanics of how you cast your spells. So with that, we can finally get into preparing our spells list for our bard. So, now that we've discussed how spellcasting works, we can start inputting the information for our character. As a bard, my spellcasting ability is Charisma. That's going to be what determines my spell save DC, my spell attack bonus, and some spell effects. My spell save DC is going to be 8 plus my proficiency bonus plus my Charisma modifier. So 8 plus 2 for my proficiency bonus at level 3, plus 4 from my Charisma modifier, for a total of 14. And my spell attack bonus is going to be my proficiency bonus plus my Charisma modifier, so 2 plus 4. At level 3, I have 2 cantrips that I know, and I've got 6 spells that I know. I've got 4 level 1 spell slots and 2 level 2 spell slots that I can use in any sort of scenario that I need them. So now we're going to go through and pick out what cantrips and spells we know from the Bard's spell list and fill out the rest of what we've got. Alright, so now I've got my 2 cantrips and my 6 spells written down, along with some of their information so I can go back and cross-reference. As you can see here, with each one I've got how many actions or how much time it takes to cast, the target or range, the length of time it lasts, and the components necessary. So my cantrips are Blade Ward and True Strike, which are both more battle utility. They allow me to hit the enemy harder and not be hit as hard. My level 1 spells, I've got Healing Word, Dissonant Whispers, Bane, and Disguise Self. Healing Word heals my friends. Dissonant Whispers harms the enemy. Bane makes it harder for the enemy to harm me. And Disguise Self is more of a roleplay spell, which allows me to change how I look. So maybe I can sneak in somewhere or get someone to give me some information or something like that. And then my level 2 spells are Enhance Ability and Blindness Deafness. Enhance Ability allows me to enhance the abilities of myself or my team in certain ways, and Blindness Deafness allows me to blind or deafen the enemy so that it's easier for us to hit them and harder for them to hit us. And so those are the spells that I know. As I went up in level, or go up in level, I would gain more spells and cantrips that I would know and add to the list. And I would be able to go back and cross-reference to see what exactly the spell does, what I need for it, different things like that. But that is the general information that I would put in the spellcasting list. And with that, we have completed the spellcasting portion of the character creation. Like I said at the beginning, spellcasting for anyone, new players or even some veteran players, can be very daunting. There's a lot of rules and a lot of little mechanics you have to figure out, character to character, player to player, different things like that. The DM may have some home rules for spellcasting. You know, different tables may look at it differently. It's a lot to take in, and there's a lot to kind of be flexible with, but once you get past it and kind of understand it. The rest is really easy by comparison. And with that, we are one step closer to finishing our character. Next time, we're just going to be finishing up a lot of the backstory stuff, actually fleshing out our character's story and who they are and why they're out adventuring and what they're doing and why they're doing what they're doing. As always, thank you all for being here. I greatly appreciate it. If you liked what you saw, be sure to check out YouTube, Twitch, Discord, TikTok. Check out all the places so you don't miss any content, news, updates, changes, anything. If you liked everything, be sure to share with your friends, share with your family, share with your neighbors, and share with your own character. You know, as you're creating them, they may want to know how they were created, so share with them. It might make them, yeah, oh, hey, so that's how it happened. Again, thank you all for being here. I greatly appreciate it. I've been having a lot of fun with this series. Have a great night, great week, great day, great everything, and I will see you in the next video. Bye, Ghostlings.